What's it mean to be before the law? So this is Cary Wolfe's book, Before the Law. And I'd like to kind of have an overview of some of the opening chapters. So he begins with looking at the question of the frame. He uses Heidegger and the question of the frame in Derrida. The frame is basically, what are the ways that we contain something? What's inside and what's outside. This seems very simple. Let's say you're taking a picture and you're like, okay, I'm going to frame the subject. Well, how do you decide what the subject is? Then let's say the subject, the person. Well, I'm just taking a picture of this person. Well, okay, are you taking a picture of just the face? Is it that you're going to include the shoulders? Is it a full body picture? What's included? What's excluded? And what's included and excluded is dependent upon judgment. There's a standard by which one judges. So to say before the law, when one comes in, to look at a frame is to look at the standards of judgment. And then he moves to this term before the law, which is a Kafka story, then a philosopher Jacques Derrida essay, and now Cary Wolfe's book. Before the law means two things, cleverly. One is prior to the law, and one is standing in front of the law and being judged. So to stand in front of the law and being judged means there's an apparatus in place that has predetermined values by which one judges who's inside and who's outside, who's within legal rights and outside of legal rights. Basically the question of the frame again, and the standards by which one judges the insides and outsides of that. To be before the law, meaning being prior to the law, means that there are modes of being in the world that are prior to our governmental systems that judge those modes of being. So being alive or being an animal or any of those things are before the law, as in prior to the law. But also animals are subject to the law. That is, we impose a variety of laws on the landscape and on humans and the land and the way we rule the landscape, and those affect a variety of animals. We also have laws saying that animals are property, and that obviously the animals didn't have a say in that. So he moves then from this question of frame and the frame of the law to look at ways of engaging with the conversation of a law. The primary mode that has been used, particularly in animal rights, is to argue around questions of rights. And this is often used in analytic discourse, and it's used in legal discourse. But for continental philosophers like Cary Wolfe and Jacques Derrida, those are considered a bit too thin, that rights are based on entitlements, and already that is predetermined as to who gets to bear those entitlements. And the animal is often left out. He then turns in the second chapter to Judith Butler in her book Precarious Life, particularly the second chapter, Precarious Life, which looks at this question of vulnerability. That is, we can define ourselves not by rights and entitlements, but by what Bentham calls, can they suffer? Not are animals intelligent, not can animals speak, but can they suffer? And if they suffer, their due consideration. Or in Butler's terms, because we are vulnerable to one another, we don't have what's called an ontology of personhood. That is, we aren't singular beings and units that bump into each other. We're in fact interrelated. To be in a society, to be in a community, is to define ourselves in relationship to another. And so we're precarious in the sense that how others see us and how we relate to them does affect our sense of identity and being. The loss of another affects us, including, of course, now Butler doesn't talk about animals, but Cary Wolfe weaves that in. So this is an ethics that is beyond calculation. It's not a rights ethics that is an if-then statements of a moral sum, then we should do that. And it's beyond reciprocation. It's not, well, can this other subject, individual, see me as an ethical being? If they see me as ethical, I'll treat them as ethical. So there's not a sense of reciprocity here, right? Animals don't necessarily always see us as reciprocal agents and moral beings. And when I say animals, okay, granted that's a wide range, and we can talk about the problem of, lumping everything that's not human into the animal. And of course, humans are animals as well. But barring that, here's that problem of so it's beyond calculation or reciprocity. And toward the end of the second chapter, and really the frame for much of the rest of the work, is around this issue of biopolitics. Biopolitics is put forward particularly by Foucault and then Agamben, Michel Foucault, French philosopher who was writing about biopolitics in the 70s into the mid-80s. And then Giorgio Agamben, who wrote about biopolitics more in the 90s up till fairly present. So in Foucault's formulation, the difference is Foucault's formulation is historical, Agamben's is structural. So for Foucault, there are a variety of ways in which the government has imposed, or the state has imposed itself. He says by the 18th century, a new form came into place by which the government could, or the state what he calls the state apparatus, the systems could be put in place to regulate the quality of life. If you think about food systems and policies towards food systems today, right, the government supplements some types of food growth, farming, does not supplement others. That is, they have giveaways and tax breaks, etc. So where they give tax breaks might seed particular types of food systems. Those types of food systems then affect our own particular health. Or we can think about national health care and insurance plans, etc. as another way. We can think about air quality, etc. Anything that could be regulated and thought of in those terms. So Foucault sees this as taking place really at the beginning of the 18th century, and that's a whole other conversation. But he sees that beginning of the 18th century, and he's looking not at what Cary Wolfe calls the thin subject of legal discourse, but the robust subject, that is, what it means to be a being in the world and dependent on a state of affairs for one's livelihood, and having those state of affairs being regulated by the state, a variety of state apparatus that can determine life and death. So that's biopolitics. The biological element of beings is dependent upon particular politics, is leveraged by that politics. Who gets to live, who gets to die. Agamben comes in, and his idea is structural. That is, he doesn't see this as biopolitics as taking place at a historical moment, 18th century. He says by the very nature of having a state, of having a government, it creates particular dynamics or framings of who's in and out. Who's in is what's called bios, or those who have the good life. And then who's out is zoe, he's using Greek terms, of the animal nature. So animals are out, and humans simply as animals are out. But those with the good life, with the social life, bios, are in. In between these two is what he calls bare life. There's a human who has been put into exile, cast out of the social, but the person is not simply an animal, because they're recognized by the state. They're recognized as one who's cast out, or the state could re-include them. So this is called bare life. That bare life is also called homo sacer. That is one who could be killed or sacrificed for the good of the state. Now, the state itself gets to make those determinations, right? They have the mode of judgment by which they can say, we determine who can live and die. And so the state is in what's called a state of exception. As they are exceptional, they are outside the law and able to create laws that are imposed on individuals. So the state of exception and the homo sacer, or the one who can be sacrificed in bare life, those are in relationship to each other as these sort of biopolitical entities. Where are animals here? There are those who want to invite animals into a good life, bios, but of course, in general, they're outside of that. They're not even normally considered as in a state of, in homo sacer, ones who could be sacrificed or in exile, because they've never had the right to be in bios. They've never had the right to be in the state as citizens. They are outside of even bare life. There are those who advocate for animals who say, no, they have a place. They are in bare life because we could allow them in. And seeing in that way, we challenge the state or the nation and its exceptionalism, its state of exception, by which it includes and then excludes, and by which it excludes animals, in particular kinds of animals, and gives us the right of them over as property and the right to death, the right to kill them. So this is an overview. If we think of Cary Wolfe's Before the Law as the question of frames, and the question of before the law both as prior to the law and standing before a law that judges, it judges according to a biopolitics. The biopolitics is determined by a series of apparatus that is, for Foucault, historical. And we've seen, for example, a variety of historical evolutions of law, particularly over the last years, and how those laws then invade or affect what it means to be human. And then it's a state of exception or a biopolitical set of relationships, according to Agamben, is the state as being exceptional and making judgments of those inside and outside the state, those in bios, those with bare life, or homo sacer. Hopefully that helps and gives a context for Cary Wolfe's Before the Law.